Hello and welcome back. Quickly, in this video, we will talk about the microservices communication types because it's very important that we understand what the communication types are when it comes to microservices. Now, the communication types are nothing new. I believe they are types that you've already used in your application, whether monolithic applications or microservices applications. There are essentially two microservices communication types. One is the synchronous communication and the other is the asynchronous communication. Okay, so let's see what the synchronous communication looks like. Now, for the synchronous communication in microservices architecture is also the same kind of communication used in monolithic applications or architectures. Okay, so the synchronous communications involves the request response pattern. Okay, so the client sends a request to the server and then waits for a response from the server. Now, this communication could be clients, your front end, web application, mobile application, or it could be within between microservices. So maybe between API gateway and your authentication service, or between your authentication service and your payment service. Okay, so it involves the client or the request response patterns. The client sends a request, waits for the server to return a response. We've seen this in our front-end application. When we use HTTP, we send a request and then we usually wait for a response before we proceed. So in this kind of communication, once a request is sent, the client has to wait for a response before they can proceed. Okay, so the client can't really do anything in the application until they get a response. So this is just the idea of synchronous communication. And for the application we are going to build, we are going to use this communication pattern as well. Okay, like I said previously, we are not going to allow communication directly from our client, that is the front end, to any microservice. Every communication will go from the client to the API gateway, and it's going to be a synchronous communication. We are going to use HTTP or the HTTPS pattern of protocol for the communication. So this is just the basic idea of synchronous communication. The client sends a request to the server and then waits for a response from the server. Now, this form of communication could also be used between services. It doesn't only involve the front end and your microservices. It could also be communication between microservices, because you could decide, okay, for communication between my microservices, I want to use HTTP. Okay, and in that case, it will involve the synchronous communication. Now, the client sends a request and waits for a response from the service. HTTP uses synchronous communication. So we are familiar with this. When you send a request from your client, front end or whatever, you wait for a response from the server before you proceed. And then the communication protocol used can be HTTP or HTTPS. So this is just the basic idea of how synchronous communication works. Now, the second communication type used is the asynchronous communication. Okay, now this here, it doesn't really involve the request response. Yeah, you send a request, probably you could wait for the response, or you could proceed with doing other things before the response is returned. But asynchronous here just involves the client sending a request and then continuing with other tasks while the response is being returned, if one is actually required, or it just sends the request to the other services that requires that. And it involves using events or message queue. So as you can see here, the client sends the request and sends it to the queue. Okay, and then the queue, depending on what type of queue, if it's a fan out, if it's a direct message. If it's a direct message, then the message will go directly to the microservices that requires it. Or if it's a fan out, it goes to all the services that requires it. In this case, in this diagram, it's using a fan out type of queue. Okay, so what it means is all the services are listening for that event from the queue will receive whatever event is sent from the client. And in this case, the client doesn't have to wait. They can proceed with doing other things. Okay, so it could be, maybe you send, for another example could be using WebSockets. You could send a WebSocket request and you don't have to wait for the response. You could go ahead to do some other things in the application. So asynchronous communication just involves the client sending a request and then proceeding to do other things without waiting for a response from the server. The client sends a request but doesn't wait for a response from the server or services. It uses the advanced messaging queuing protocol with message brokers like Kafka and RabbitMQ. So in our own case, we are going to be using RabbitMQ. And then we'll see how we can implement the direct messaging, the fan-out messaging. And lastly, communication could be one-to-one or one-to-many. Now, in the diagram, the communication type used is one-to-many. Okay? So the client sends an event or a message and it's been listened for by many microservices or many list consumers. Okay, so it's been consumed by different microservices. One-to-one involves just sending a direct message to a specific microservice. Okay, so we are going to see how to implement the one-to-one communication or the one-to-many communication. So this is just the basic idea of what synchronous communication and the asynchronous communication types involve.